Well, first of all, let me thank Patrick for inviting me, and Leslie Van Duzer for also, she's a great old friend and is doing a wonderful job here for inviting me to come to Vancouver. You know, for many of us, Vancouver really represents one of the interesting experiments in urban design. I'm not going to get into that tonight. I'm going to talk about another search and discovery process, which I think urban design is all about. So let's get going. You all have seen this diagram ad infinitum, but I find it really tragic that this idea that buildings and transportation, in other words, the built environment as we know it, represents 65 to 70% of our CO2 emissions in the U.S. This diagram is at least 10 years old, and it hasn't changed. And the longer it doesn't change, the more serious our problems are. And I put it up here just as a reminder that we can and should play a major role in changing this thing. As Patrick pointed out, I started out as a passive solar pioneer, in other words, building all of these passive solar homes in Princeton, and doing daylighting and teaching this in schools of architecture all over the country, and actually teaching it in offices before going to Minnesota and then on to Berkeley. But I've now tried to put all of this together at the neighborhood scale. And I'm sure for many of you, anybody who's taken classes with Patrick, this is not going to be new news. The way to achieve a more lower carbon existence, I will argue, is best achieved at the neighborhood scale. And it's because while buildings are critical, they really are too small. And the large utilities, while essential, are much too big. The neighborhood scale gives you the opportunity to integrate all of those, what people have described as urban metabolism. The transportation, energy, water, waste, food, information, and social interaction that a building scale and a big utility can't work on. It also implies and engages an expanded role of the urban landscape to deliver these eco-services. It also enables cogeneration and a smart microgrid. So I'm arguing that the neighborhood is a design unit that has unique design opportunities and potentials, especially when you look at resiliency. A network of distributed, smart microgrids powered by renewables and cogeneration, especially cogeneration powered by waste, biogas and gas, provides an amazing resiliency because the neighborhood not only can power itself, but it can also help the grid. And if you've read anything about the resiliency after some of these major storms like Sandy, the social community network is one of the most important elements in having a resiliency for human beings. Finally, I want to stress that there's health and well-being dimensions to this, which have been under-monetized and under-researched. Obviously, the exercise, the access to nature, and the social network have huge impacts on social health issues. In fact, some people have said it's one of the most important things, more important than the drug industry, is access to natural systems in the urban environment. So I started this, again, almost almost 10 years ago. And at Berkeley in the studio, we came up with the idea of doing an eco-block. While there are only 3 circles here, energy, water, and waste, there should be transportation and food involved. But for historical accuracy, I'm just showing you this one, because this was the generation. And we did this in China after doing a studio, first in Qingdao. We got a lot of money from the Moore Foundation to try to build an eco-block neighborhood in China. And we went to Qingdao to try to do this. And we located the site along a brand new bus rapid transit system, as you can see here. And this was a neighborhood which was roughly 700 meters square, the classic Chinese superblock. And my first question is, how many of you have seen a Chinese superblock? Not too many, a few. So you know what happens in these superblocks. A fence gets put around it, a single gate with a guard, parking is put around the perimeter, and there are multiple repeatable blocks, anywhere from 12 to 20 stories, put around the landscape. That's what was planned for this site. And we were going to do, these were all those blocks. We were going to build a neighborhood that actually had streets, pedestrian ways, towers along the park. This was a whole park that was going to treat all the sewage and water. But first of all, we were going to have walkable distances to a major stop in the middle of the block. So it was transit-oriented. Have any of you seen this diagram before? Some have. Okay. So I always go back to this because our students and I thought about possibly trying to reduce the energy demand in the buildings and then trying to figure out how we would supply that demand, either by wind on the roof, PV, photovoltaic collectors on the roof, or as shading devices. But it was very hard to provide enough renewable supply. So we turned to the waste systems. And the interesting thing is if you take the food waste from the kitchen, you take the sludge out of the septic settling tanks in the basement, and you take the green waste from the landscape, you can do a biodigester that makes electricity that can make up the difference. We did this calculation theoretically. The city loved this in Qingdao, and we went to Arab engineers and persuaded them that this was a good idea. And they did a study, and we did all these systems where you reduce the load by shading, daylighting, natural ventilation, passive solar. Most of these buildings are all in concrete, so they have thermal mass, which is terrific. High performance windows, efficient lighting, efficient, especially refrigerators and equipment, etc. We then can supply the energy with PVs, wind, and the anaerobic digester. And when you put it all together, this was back in 2004, you could get to complete resource self-sufficiency. At only a 10% increase in the cost of the systems, which is remarkable. There's no silver bullet. You have to do all of the steps. A better facade, natural ventilation, passive heating, daylighting, efficient equipment. You can get somewhere between a 40 to 50% reduction in the load, and then you can use photovoltaics, wind, and waste as your energy sources. The big breakthrough, and it's still in process, is this idea of having a two-phase anaerobic digester, where you take the household organic waste, the green waste, and the sludge. You can have a series of tanks where you have a bacteria that breaks down these solids into a liquid. You have a buffer tank. You have a new tank, which is the gasification tank, different bacteria. You get methane or hydrogen out, you get water, and you get night soil. So it's even better than composting. The nice thing about this is much, much more efficient than what happens in current sewage treatment plants, where you just do a one-step phase where you stick all the organics in one place. And the trouble is the bacteria in this and the bacteria in this compete a little bit, so it's not that efficient. So this is a real breakthrough. This was pioneered actually at UC Davis. This is the model set up. You can see you get hydrogen, methane, compost, and water. So what do we do with the water? If you've taken the sludge out, and you have now an effluent that has organic waste in it, but not the solids, you can use a living machine or a constructed wetland to clean it to a certain degree, and then you can use other things to top it off. So at this stage, you can use it for toilets, or irrigating the landscape, and you can use other technologies to make it drinkable. You can also add rainwater and a settling tank and treat that and add it to this process. The idea here is once you have primed the pump in the neighborhood, you reuse the water over and over and over again, and you only have to replace it with rainwater. Now, do you think that's going to be important in California? Maybe not so much in parts of Canada, but certainly in California. Right now, we throw it all away, which is ridiculous. The technology of treating these systems in a hybrid, sort of natural engineered process, I'm a real fan of the living machine. I promote it wherever I go. Again, the settling tank, the sludge goes elsewhere, the effluent gets pumped through a series of tanks that have gravel in them, plants, a little topsoil. The water sits in there for a while. The plants and the bacteria do a job. Then it gets pumped into the next one and it remains empty, so you get an aerobic, an anaerobic, an aerobic, an anaerobic process. When it comes out, the water quality is actually better than most of the urban water in China. But what you do is measure the quality, and then you can figure out what you want to do with it. You can top it off even more if you want to, or you can use it for toilets and irrigation. What does it look like? Have you all seen these? Maybe, some of you. So, this is in Esalen in California. This is in Las Vegas. This is in Vermont. And this is inside the lobby of a building. The amount of space that you need when you use this hybrid system of pumping the effluent through requires very, very little area to treat the sewage in the building. The PUC, the Public Utility Commission building in San Francisco, has a living machine in it which treats all its sewage in the lobby. The lobby is the sewage treatment plant. Well, the tragedy of my experience in China was that every time we would get to the point of actually going ahead with the project, something would happen. Either the mayor would be changed, or we had a zero carbon university, which I'm not showing you tonight. The university president would be changed, or a vice mayor had already made a deal with the developer, and the developer didn't want to do it differently because it was a little risky. So we never built one of these things. very interested. When you write it, you care tremendously. I still care a lot about it. But even more important, you care about what the implications are. So I'm going to take you very quickly through the book, and then we're going to get to where I think we should be as a result. So what's the book all about? It is about the very first efforts at an integrated whole system design at the neighborhood scale. And you've heard this thing about the public space, the landscape, the infrastructure, the transportation, all of these things. They tried to think of them together in a very preliminary way. I used a very simplified case study method, which is descriptive initially, analytical of those various processes, and then some observations and lessons. And I did this in the following categories: process and plan, transportation, urban form, green space, energy, waterways, social agenda, resilience. How many of you have been to either Boa 1, which is in Malmö, Sweden, Hammarby, which is in Stockholm, Kronsberg, which is outside of Hanover, or Robson and Fraker? A few. Do you know about these places? Okay. Good. So, I mean, the story of each one of these places is really interesting, and I encourage you to read the book. But I will try to summarize it. So, what was really key about the plan process was the leadership role the city played. Now, I don't know the history of Vancouver here, but certainly in Europe, the city played a major role because they could get outside funds from the EU. They created development committees, usually representing everybody who could possibly be involved. They could force integration across the agencies and utilities. This was key because the energy people didn't speak to the water people, didn't speak to the transportation people, didn't speak to the waste people. And the city could say, nope, we're not doing it that way anymore. You have to come up with an integrated idea. Big deal. And they got money to do it. They also used master plans, which is a kind of old-fashioned way to think about things to some degree. Some they did by competition, some with consultants, and some within the planning agencies. They have a pretty good representation in these examples. The key thing was that the city was the horizontal developer. Now, do you all know what that means? What a horizontal developer does?
Ground plane.
What?
The ground plane?
Yeah, they design